In April 1909, a man identified as G.E. Kincaid said that while traveling alone along the Colorado River, he saw something on the wall of the Grand Canyon that didn't belong there. It wasn't a shadow. It wasn't a natural fissure in the limestone. It was an entrance. It stood high above the river. It looked as if it had been carved into the canyon wall. It wasn't visible from above, and even someone traveling on the water could only spot it if their boat approached from exactly the right angle. According to Kincaid, he climbed up there, went inside, and found a system of chambers large enough to accommodate thousands of people. The Arizona Gazette ran the story within a few days. It gave the name of the Grand Canyon. It gave the year. It named the institution said to be connected to the discovery. Then the story faded from the record. There was no public field report, no catalogued artifacts, no published photographs. There was no file explaining why one of the strangest archaeological claims in American newspaper history appeared once, was expanded upon once, and then vanished from the official record. If you want to follow the kinds of discoveries that disappear from the record and still leave a trail behind, like this video and subscribe now, because sometimes the strongest evidence of something is the disappearance of the very file that should have been kept about it. And the story should have ended there. But long before Kincaid's name appeared in the press, the Hopi had already been preserving a tradition that spoke of a world beneath the canyon, an exit point, underground chambers, a place remembered not as a rumor from 1909, but as something much older. If this was merely a newspaper fabrication, it had taken its form from something that was already there. If it wasn't a fabrication, the question was far more serious. What exactly had been found inside the Grand Canyon, and why was the institution mentioned in the story, claiming that no records existed? The official explanation is simple. The 1909 news story is a product of the sensationalist journalism of the era. A reporter wanted a big story, chose a massive setting like the Grand Canyon, populated it with mummies, chambers, and foreign inscriptions, and then added the Smithsonian's name to lend the text credibility. This explanation makes sense, because if such a discovery had actually been made, something would have remained. A photograph, a field notebook, a shipping record, a museum catalogue number. At the very least, an official file stating, "This claim is false." But this is precisely where the gap begins. Because the story isn't just a single sentence. The news article published on April 5, 1909, wasn't written like a one-line rumor. It describes Kincaid's journey along the Colorado River, the height of the entrance above river level, the layout of the interior chambers, the stone passageways, the statues, the inscriptions, and the preserved bodies. The second news article, published 4 days later, expands on the claim rather than retracting it. If it's a newspaper hoax, it's a surprisingly patient one. If it's an exploration report, it's a surprisingly silent one. The first physical moment Kincaid describes is the center of it all. In that section of the Colorado River, the canyon walls rise on either side of the water, in some places nearly vertical, in others seeming to recede in layers. When viewed from inside a boat, what the human eye seeks is not the scenery, it is the current. It is a rock outcrop. It is the next safe landing spot. But Kincaid says he sees a regular darkness on the wall. Unlike natural cavities, it's a sharper, more deliberate darkness. He pulls his boat close to the shore, climbs ashore, and reaches the entrance. The first thing he notices inside is the vastness of the space. This is no small cave carved out by rainwater. According to the report, the entrance is the mouth of a system connecting to deeper chambers. The first chamber is just the beginning. Next come narrow passages, then larger halls. On the walls are drawings that the reporter described as unidentified markings. Some chambers are said to contain well-preserved bodies in a seated position. Others contain stone or metal objects. Still others feature artistic styles that do not easily fit within North America's known historical framework. At this point, caution is warranted. None of this has been independently verified. There is no publicly available excavation report. There is no accepted record of these findings in the Smithsonian catalogues. Every part of the story relies first and foremost on what the newspaper reported. But the interesting part of the case is not how grand the claim is, it is how such a grand claim could leave such a clean gap in the record. Because the news story doesn't just say, a cave was found, it names an institution, it establishes a research connection. It implies a process of discovery. If it's all fiction, the newspaper didn't just place an imaginary room inside the canyon, it also inserted one of America's most renowned scientific institutions into the story. If it's all true, then the file that should have been created around that institution is nowhere to be found today. Both possibilities are troubling. First, the story is entirely fabricated. In this case, the 1909 text has constructed a detailed, fake archaeological world that strangely resembles the much older underground narratives of Hopi tradition. Second, there is a genuine discovery at the core of the story. In this case, what is missing is not just a cave entrance but a field file. The missing file is the second object of this story. The first was the entrance on the canyon wall. The second is the record that should have been kept about that entrance but cannot be found today. The Smithsonian later stated that it had no verified record of this discovery in its possession. There is no clear file indicating that G.E. Kincaid worked on behalf of the institution. The academic connection mentioned in the news report cannot be verified. There is no catalogue number for the artifacts. There is no accepted collection in the museum's storage that matches this description. Most historians would close the case at this point. If there is no record, there is no discovery. This is a reasonable position from an academic standpoint. However, from an investigative perspective, the absence of records is not an answer by itself, especially in a case where the news story contains so many details about measurements, locations, institutions, and objects. Because sometimes the absence of records means the event never took place. Other times, it means the event was never allowed to become part of the record. Kincaid's story was investigated repeatedly in the years that followed. Researchers combed through old newspaper archives. They examined the Smithsonian's responses. They compared the two articles published by the Arizona Gazette. They checked to see if the name G.E. Kincaid appeared in other records. Some leads were found, others led to dead ends. But the central gap remained. There was still no central file to corroborate such a discovery. This by itself does not make the story true. But it's not enough to dismiss it either. Because the strangest aspect of the 1909 news story is not just the magnitude of the claim, but the fact that it emerged in two stages. The first text opens the door to the discovery for the reader. The second text, rather than closing the door, steps inside. It mentions the layout of the room, the arrangement of objects, the ongoing investigation, and that the findings would be subjected to scientific examination. For a newspaper hoax, these are unnecessary details. For a genuine discovery, however, they are the first link in the official chain that should follow. That chain is nowhere to be seen. Normally, such a claim would leave traces in at least 4 separate places: editorial notes in the newspaper's own archives regarding the source of the story, correspondence with federal authorities regarding a discovery permit, and incoming and outgoing letters involving the Smithsonian or affiliated entities. And if artifacts are mentioned, inventory records of the objects that were transported or examined. In an area like the Grand Canyon, especially after the 1906 Antiquities Act, one would not expect a major archaeological find to remain purely a personal adventure. But the evidence doesn't behave that way. There is the newspaper article. Beyond that, the evidence is either non-existent, fragmented, or never publicly verified. Thus, the case shifts from a true or false question to, where did the record break? The first gap begins with the name. G.E. Kincaid appears in the news report, but not in the institutional records where researchers would expect him to appear. This does not automatically make the story a hoax. In newspapers of the era, name spellings, initials, and occupational titles were often mixed up. But it does make verification difficult. Scattered traces of a man's existence may be found, yet no official, solid link can be found proving that this man made the discovery. The second gap lies in the location itself. The news report does not give modern researchers the exact coordinates of the entrance. The descriptions of distance and elevation along the Colorado River are not enough to narrow the target inside a canyon of that scale. This leaves the story in a strange limbo. It is concrete enough not to feel like an abstract legend. It is vague enough that no one can simply go and verify it. The third discrepancy concerns the artifacts. Mummies, statues, inscriptions, and chambers are described, yet none of these objects appear with an accepted collection number. There are no boxes sitting in a museum storage room labeled Grand Canyon Cave, 1909. There is no inventory entry under that title in the public catalogue. For such a grand claim, the silence is almost too clean. It is precisely this cleanliness that is the reason the story has not died out in a century. In the 1920s and 1930s, when local history enthusiasts interested in the region began collecting old newspaper clippings again, Kincaid's text briefly resurfaced. But once again, the official response remained the same. No verified discovery could be found in institutional records. Some consider this the definitive refutation. Others, on the contrary, ask, if it's just a fabrication, why have so many people continued to search for it? As Grand Canyon tourism grew in the 1950s, the story lingered like a ghost on the fringes of guide narratives. It never made it into the main narrative. It wasn't included in park brochures. It wasn't taken seriously in scientific publications. But in local compilations and old notes passed down by word of mouth, it resurfaced as the cave that made the newspaper. Each time it resurfaced, the same problem arose. There was a text, but no file. In the 1970s, as microfilm archives became more accessible, researchers re-examined issues of the Arizona Gazette. The first news story was found. The second was found. But the expected third element was still missing: a correction, a retraction, an official follow-up, or published findings. If it was a major newspaper error, why is there no clear retraction? If it was a major discovery, why is there no clear report? Neither door closes completely. After the 1990s, as internet forums and independent archive enthusiasts amplified the story, the problem took on a different form. The story now becomes easy to exaggerate. It gets mixed up with irrelevant theories, fake maps, fabricated photos, and comments that disrespectfully exploit sacred traditions. As a result, the field becomes too noisy for a clean investigation. But when you filter out the noise, 3 original pieces remain: the 1909 newspaper article, the gap in institutional records, and the Hopi memory, which conveyed the idea of a world beneath the canyon long before modern news reports. The most dangerous mistake when connecting these 3 pieces is to use Hopi tradition to prove the newspaper story. This must not be done, because oral tradition is not a detective clue, it is a living cultural memory. But to leave it out entirely would be to erase the story's oldest layer. The correct approach lies somewhere in between. The Hopi narrative does not prove the accuracy of the newspaper article, but it does show that, in the geography where the 1909 text emerged, the idea of an underworld already carried a much older meaning. This elevates Kincaid's story beyond a simple "the newspaper made it up" case, because even if it were fake, it wasn't written on a blank canvas. It was written on a canvas that is the canyon's own memory. Because the Grand Canyon is no ordinary place. By 1909, the region was already under federal scrutiny. It was like a vast open archive for scientists, geologists, cartographers, and explorers. In a place like this, for such a grand claim to emerge and then fade away without leaving any official trace seems less like a coincidence and more like an omission. And right in the midst of this omission, Hopi tradition returns. In Hopi narratives, the Grand Canyon is not merely a landscape. The idea of a passage from beneath the earth to the present-day world, the Sipapu, is part of a sacred memory passed down through generations. This tradition is not merely an embellishment of an outside newspaper article. It existed even before 1909. It existed before the Arizona Gazette reporter, before the Smithsonian debate, and before modern internet research. That is why it must be handled with care. Hopi tradition is not mere decoration used to validate a newspaper claim. It is a sacred and cultural memory. But the important point from a historical perspective is this: a much older oral tradition already carries the idea of a world beneath the canyon, places of passage, and underground chambers. The newspaper describes chambers inside the canyon. Hopi tradition recalls an underground world connected to the canyon. The newspaper speaks of dark passageways. Tradition speaks of an exit from beneath the earth into the present-day world. The newspaper recounts a discovery that modern institutions have not verified. Tradition carries a memory preserved long before the advent of modern institutions. These two sources do not prove the same thing, but they look into the same void. If the 1909 news report was fabricated, why does it align so strongly with this ancient subterranean motif that already existed beneath the canyon? If the report is true, why does the modern record system surrounding that discovery remain so silent? This is where the real tension of the Grand Canyon case arises. There is no single source. There are three distinct layers. The first layer is the physical claim, an entrance in the canyon wall, a system of chambers inside, passages and objects. The second layer is the institutional gap, the absence of a publicly available corroborating file at the institution in question. The third layer is local memory. In Hopi tradition, the idea of a world beneath the canyon predates 1909 by far. None of these, on its own, provides a definitive answer. But when placed side by side, they undermine the comfort of the official explanation. Because the official explanation demands this. Set the newspaper article aside, accept the absence of a record as sufficient, treat the oral tradition as a separate cultural realm, and close the case. But the real question is different. Even when these pieces are closed off separately, why do they all converge around the same geographical void? The walls of the Grand Canyon may conceal thousands of caves, crevices, and passages. Some are known, some have been documented, some are protected as sacred sites and are not open to the public. This is a boundary that must be respected. Not every closed-off place needs to be explored. Not every sacred narrative can be turned into an excavation site. But the 1909 news report claims something else. It speaks of a place that has already been entered, of chambers that have already been seen, of objects said to have already been removed. If this claim is false, where is the record of the error? If it is true, where is the record of the findings? In either case, the missing element is the same: documentation. In 2000, statements from Hopi cultural preservation groups emphasized that certain areas within the Grand Canyon should be viewed as sacred sites rather than subjects of public research. These statements do not corroborate the Arizona Gazette report. They do not endorse Kincaid's claims. They do not state anything definitive about mummies or inscriptions, but they do remind us that certain areas of the canyon carry meanings older and more profound than modern curiosity. This does not diminish the story, it enhances it. Because the question is no longer simply, was Kincaid telling the truth? The question is, was there a place beneath or within the Grand Canyon, one preserved by local memory and also described, by chance, in a modern newspaper article? And if such a place existed, why did it fall outside the history of public exploration after 1909? The Smithsonian's no record response can be interpreted in two ways at this point. The first is the simple reading, no record, because the event never happened. The second is the more unsettling reading, no record, because the file was never kept in a publicly accessible system, or if it was, it never remained visible. There is no definitive answer, but there is a definitive silence. The two Arizona Gazette articles are still available to read. The Hopi tradition's memory of the underworld still endures. The walls of the Grand Canyon are still there, but the exact location of the entrance described in the article, the existence of the rooms inside, the accuracy of the measurements, the fate of the artifacts, and the true nature of the institutional connection remain unexplained. That is why the story has not faded away for over a century, not because it is a good fabrication, but because at every point where it should have closed, it leaves a gap that remains open. If there was an entrance in the canyon wall, it might still be there somewhere inside the rock today. Even if it isn't, the story written about it still reveals something else. Why the vision of a room inside one of America's greatest natural monuments, a room that official history cannot easily explain, has held such a deep fascination. Perhaps Kincaid was just a newspaper character, Perhaps the rooms never existed. Perhaps the reason nothing is found in the Smithsonian files is that there is nothing to be found. But perhaps in 1909, a man really did look up from the Colorado River, saw a darkness on the canyon wall where there shouldn't have been one, went inside, and encountered something that wouldn't fit into America's official past. One newspaper published it twice. No public file confirms it. And Hopi tradition preserved the idea of a world beneath the canyon for much longer, and the Grand Canyon still stands in the same place. The record is blank. The entrance is missing. The question remains open.